Are you still wearing your wife's underwear?
Wait, we're planning on having something tonight is all I can say.
I'll need to have a little violin music there.
Asking me if I had left a pair of my underwear in the seat of his Jeep. And my Victoria's Secret underwear jumping out of bed at that point. I get really yelled at him sometimes. We're a little worried about your home group.
We'll start that over.
Yeah.
Marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today. Marriage, that blessed arrangement, that dream within a dream.
I'm not sure why we included that, but I'm Steve.
And I'm Mary, and we've been married for 36 years.
So we have lived a lot of life, which I think qualifies us to talk about marriage and the family, from newlyweds unto right now, navigating our way through life as grandparents. Now, we don't want to give you the common suggestions that you probably have been able to see in most marriage manuals or in parenting book. You've already seen these common sense things. We want to share from our life some highlights of our parenting and being married that really impacted our life. And we've divided it into chapters. Chapter 1, The Secret to Married Life. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't know who to give it credit to, but I've said it at both of our daughters' engagements. To be married is good. To be happily married is very good. To be happily married for a lifetime is among the fine arts. And from the moment we're married, don't most of us aspire to be happily married for a lifetime? Now, either at your wedding or at someone else's wedding, you probably have witnessed the married couples dance. And that's when married couples are invited up onto the floor and the DJ plays a couple of minutes of music and then stops them and says, all those couples that have been married 5 years or longer continue to dance. And then he does this for 10 years and 15 and 20, all the way up to what probably would be 50 or 60 or 70 years. And finally, only one couple is left dancing on the dance floor. And then the DJ poses the question to him. He says, what is the secret to your 50 or 60 years of marriage? What he's asking is this very question. What is the secret of being happily married for a lifetime? And we wait as they carefully, in a few words, try to explain this profound wisdom. I've been disappointed every time that those highly anticipated words, because usually you'll hear something like this.
I just agreed with everything he said. Or another favorite is, happy wife, happy life.
No, I heard the secret to married life when I was really young. And although I heard it, I don't think I really completely understood the wisdom in it, or really the incredible impact it was going to have on my life, really our lives, until I was older. We've heard a lot of marriage advice during our lifetime, but this advice actually came from my mother. My mother had an incredible love for my father. They had a marriage that I've never really seen with any other marriage. And she had an incredible, intense love for her children. And so it was 2 years ago, in her last days of life, that I was there with her. And her eyes were shut, and her features were hardened, and there was this really faint rhythmic breathing. And if you've ever been with someone at the very end of their life, you usually try to share with them the most important thing that they've ever taught you, or something that really has had an impact on your life. And so holding her hand, I said, Mom, I really want to thank you for praying for my wife, Mary, when I was really young, because you were so faithful in praying for her, and I really can't imagine a life without her. And there was this really faint, hand squeeze. And I told her some other things, and then I said, Mom, I want to thank you so much for how you loved our children, Whitney and Lindsay. She had such a fierce love for our kids. She would visibly tremble when she was around them. And then I finally was making my way, leading to that pivotal thing that made the most difference in my life. The thing she taught me that was really the secret to life. I said, and Mother, I remember when you told me that you can have a relationship with Jesus. You can know him, and you can actually know his word, and you could serve other people, but you will never be full of joy. You will never have a true happiness, and you'll never be at peace unless you fall in love with him. She said it must be an authentic, intense relationship. And her eyes opened, and among those hard features, those soft eyes, and she squeezed my hand for the last time. You're so right, Mom. You're so right. The secret to married life, the principle is, my love for Mary is dependent on my love for God. And this principle is littered throughout Scripture. In Joshua, he is older now, and he has gathered all the Israelites together. And he sees this so often that they begin to waver in their love for God. And so he's wondering, have you abandoned your love for God, as a nation? Have you abandoned your love for God as a family? And so then he says those familiar words, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And then we see it so often. Jesus repeats in several stories this very same principle, but we miss it. In Matthew, he's has a crowd around him, and he knows what they're thinking. It's what we usually think as well. He's saying, don't worry about what you're wearing. Don't worry about, what you're going to eat. And then he says those words, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and then all these things will be given to you. He's given us the order of importance. Our love for God first, and then all of these things, these other things, like to be happily married for a lifetime, will be given to you. It goes against all of our human instincts, which tell us, love your spouse above everything else, or anyone else, or your children. But Jesus says no. He says, give your greatest love to me and my Father in heaven, and you won't believe the depth of love that I'll give you in return for your spouse and your children.
Doesn't mathematically seem to work out, does it? You give the Lord your greatest love, and you have an even greater love for your spouse than you would ever know. But most principles of our faith don't make sense. We die so we can live. We are richest when we are poorest. We're strongest when we are the weakest. And we surrender so we can conquer.
We can't generate the type of love that we want for our marriage without a deep love for God. We've seen this as proof throughout our 36 years of marriage. So if you remember anything else from all the chapters that are to follow, remember this from chapter 1. Your love for your spouse is dependent on your love for God. Chapter 2, praying together. Now, I don't mean, we sit down at a meal and we pray with each other. I mean spending some time every day in prayer with each other. Now, we know it's good for us. We know its benefits, and yet we resist it. Or at least I know I did. Who was the first one of us that said we ought to pray together?
It was me.
That's right. And I find this interesting because I actually enjoy praying. But I finally relented. And I must admit, it was awkward at first. We just wanted to kind of rush and get through it. We would repeat the same things over and over every night. But finally, after doing it for a while, we actually became a lot more comfortable with it. even to the point where we reached that point where we didn't even want to miss praying together.
Sometimes I would take trips up to Harrisonburg and spend the night with my mom and dad. And every night I would call Steve and we would talk together, but we also made it a point to pray together.
Now, over time, we found these benefits from praying together.
Number 1, fewer disagreements when regularly praying together, and it was noticeable.
Number 2, there seems to be a special kind of, I don't know if that's the word of power, in praying together as a couple. Remember, God made Adam and Eve, and he took 2 different individuals and he made them one. And there's something about that oneness which gives our prayers a power that they really didn't have individually.
Number 3, you can see your spouse's heart in a prayer, sometimes in ways you didn't see it in regular conversation. Sometimes Steve and I would say something in a prayer that had never been talked about during the day.
Number 4, prayer is the most intimate thing that you can do because it's really on a spiritual level, not on a physical level.
And number 5, it gives you a chance to pray together for your children's salvation. And that's the most important thing you can do for them. And now we can pray for our grandchildren's salvation as well.
Yeah, everything else we do for them in life really pales in comparison to this choice that they make, because this choice will affect all the other choices that they make in the future. But also praying for their spouses. We began praying for Lindsay and Whitney's spouses, nearly from the time they were born. And when we met Kevin and we met Nat for the first time, we had been praying for them for nearly 20 years. And so even though it was the first time we had actually met them, there was a connectiveness because we had been talking about them for nearly 20 years. Also, I want to say something about the soul. We were talking about our children's salvation and others. There's something that Earl really taught me that I think was really profound and that I'll never forget. There was a few things that I really enjoyed about Earl at elder meetings. Earl had a habit of when he was talking about something and trying to communicate that to us in the middle of a meeting, he would rub his hands, pretty aggressively through his hair. And by the end of his thought, when he had finished speaking, his hair looked like Kramer off of Seinfeld. It was really amazing. The second thing is that Earl really saw life through a biblical worldview. And that's what caused Earl to see people's souls much differently than I think most of us do. Earl cared more about a person's soul than he cared about their physical life. And, I think we would all agree with that. But do we all believe that? The soul is eternal. The life is just so fleeting. But we really don't live like we believe that. If we were to see someone in an accident, a car accident, we would probably not hesitate to run and try to rescue them. Even if that car was on fire, probably at the cost of injuring ourselves or even losing our life, we probably wouldn't hesitate, even if we didn't know them, because we would care so much about that person's physical life. But do we really care about that person's soul as much? Earl did. Earl cared more about a person's soul than he did about their life. Chapter 3, bad habits. Don't invite these into your marriage. Now, although some may disagree with me, I think it's really toxic to a relationship. Put downs, those insultive jabs, being really critical of the other person. They are really, in my mind, a type of verbal abuse. Now, there was a couple in our former church. They seemed to really care about each other a lot, but they were constantly slinging these put downs at each other. Like, "Hey, I brought the old ball and chain."
Guess what Stupid said today?
"I'm not stupid, you old lady." Well, it was somewhat like that. But these put downs were in most all of their conversations. And while they were kind of lightheartedly said, and they probably didn't mean it to be as insultive as it was, they actually were. Gary Smalley, in his book, Love is a Decision, said he was at a conference, a marriage conference, that he was speaking, and he walked out on the stage and he was carrying a really old violin, and he held up the violin and he got no reaction from the audience. And then he began to tell the audience that it was a violin that was nearly 200 years old, and that it had been played by a number of really, famous musicians. And then he began to list all the famous, halls and concert venues that had been played in. And then he finally said that it was a Stradivarius, and it was, some of them are worth nearly $1 million. And as soon as he said that, there was a notable awe in the audience. He called it the awe factor. It was really showing high honor. And he said, when you give something high honor, then you really give it a lot of value. And when you give it that great value, then you're really treasuring it. And by giving it that high honor, it's really difficult to dishonor it. We're called to honor our father and mother. I mean, that's a commandment, to show them high value. We're called to honor our spouse. In 1 Peter 3:7, it says, in the same way, you husbands must give honor, high value, to your wives. And then he continues, treat her as you should, so that your prayers will not be hindered. And that's kind of interesting, because then he makes the connection that if you treat her with high honor, then your prayers will be heard. They won't be hindered. Now, we're not saying that you can't tell a story about your spouse. We're not saying that you're not allowed to ever tease them, just not in a way that's a put down or using really hurtful or hateful words.
I want to share a story with you. And this story starts early one morning when Steve had gotten up. It was still dark outside, and he didn't turn the light on in the bedroom. He just got dressed in the dark so he wouldn't wake me up. And he went to breakfast with one of our Capernaum friends. Well, it was a spring day, so he got dressed in his favorite cargo shorts. Well, a couple hours later, I had left the house already, and I got a frantic call from Steve asking me if I had left a pair of my underwear in the seat of his Jeep. You see, he realized that his shorts, the pockets had Velcro on them, and my Victoria's Secret underwear had been attached to the back pocket all the way to Bojangles, in and out of the crowded restaurant, and all the way back home, till it helplessly fell off in the seat of his Jeep. Well, I couldn't help but tell this story to other people for a good laugh. This story was a good, funny story, but not really a blatant put down. So you can have fun with your spouse.
Yeah, it was really months after that I was still hearing those comments like, are you still wearing your wife's underwear? So the next time you're about to put down a spouse or really anyone, let this sound of a violin pop into your mind. And honor your spouse by realizing how valuable they are. Chapter 4, Touch. Mary, I have a medical question for you.
Oh, you love those, don't you?
Yes, I do. What is the body's largest organ?
I would guess the skin.
That is correct. It's the largest organ by far. And the skin needs many things. But what do you think is the one thing that is really vital to the skin?
Well, that's easy. It's touch.
You are correct. I was first introduced to this concept in the 1990s. The New England Journal of Medicine, the JAMA report, had article after article stressing the benefits of touch. And how many times a day do you think you need to touch?
20?
You need to touch, they said, between 8 and 12 times a day. And it even recommended that parents hug their kids up to 4 times a day. Now, this was interesting because this was at a time in the practice of medicine where things began to change. Doctors that would generally go into their hospital rooms or go into their clinic rooms began to be described by their patients as becoming impersonal, or there was really a noticeable shift. And the only thing that would explain that is when they would go into their hospital or clinic rooms, they used to always go straight to the patient and they would either shake their hand or they would touch them on the shoulder. And this began a time where, and as you would see now, they immediately go in for the chart or they reach for a computer keyboard. You might say it's a big deal, but it really was a big deal. Because touch, among many things, leads to 2 positive outcomes, they said.
Number 1, it builds trust.
Now, they're talking about the trust between spouses, a husband to a wife. But they're also talking about the trust that a child would have in a parent as a result of those hugs. They also were saying it applied to the doctor. And this is where they were really surprised with the results, because when they rated it, the patients wanted their doctor's time. And they also wanted their doctor to be competent. But higher on the scale than they imagined it, they said they wanted the doctor's trust. And some of them even directly associated that with the touch.
Number 2, it reduced medical bills.
That's true. They said that married couples that touched more in the study showed that they had less anxiety, they had less depression, they had less disease states, less medicine costs, and they had lower, medical bills. Everyone's looking for ways to get healthier. And here's somewhat really simple way to do it, just through touch. Now, there's a scientific reason for this too. It's really incredible. Sensory touch leads to the release of chemicals, oxytocin, serotonin. The release of those chemicals actually helps relieve anxiety, elevate mood, and cause a sense of well-being, they call it. It's an incredible way that God used and created us to use the sense of just touch. There was even 2 systems they found. A discriminative system, and that's just all touch that tells us, our location, our movement, our strength. And then there's a completely other different system of touch. It's even called scientifically the emotional touch system. And it even has a separate sense of sensory fibers within the nerves that are conveying information to actually a different part of the brain. And it actually conveys it much more slowly. So things like hugs, kisses, even sexual touch, this is a lot different from any other type of touch, and it's felt in different parts of the brain. I love touch, but, originally I was skeptical of that. And it wasn't very long after that a group of us pharmacists began to take classes in order to get become trained to be immunizers, giving the flu shots and pneumonia, tetanus. And I was really, ready for all the things that I was to be prepared for with, how to administer and techniques and, what to expect and risk from it. But what I was really unprepared for is the result of touch, because I thought this is a really negative touch. But for people, it was actually a meaningful touch. I was really surprised because the follow-up reports of where the number of patients and their families that switched their prescriptions over to our pharmacy, under the comments where they said the reasons for that, how on that were comments that says because he gave us a shot and because we really trust him. Why should we really be surprised? It's just like, what the medical, journals were saying. Why should we really be surprised? Because touch is used so well in the Bible. In Genesis, Abraham used touch when he was administering the blessing to Isaac, and then Isaac to Jacob. And I've noticed that there's actually touch used in that. And that's why the thought is that every time you touch your children, you're actually blessing them. Jesus also used touch often, and he didn't really have to, but he chose to. Even when he was around those that were considered untouchable, those that were sentenced to a life where they would be without any kind of meaningful touch, he touched them.
I found out early in our marriage that touch was part of Steve's love language. He loves to nudge me. It used to really annoy me, but when I discovered that why he did it, now I love his nudges.
Touch. It is so simple, so underutilized, and yet such a powerful expression of love. Chapter 5. It doesn't get much better than this. Can I run with this one?
Sure.
Okay. There was a beer commercial back in the 80s. There were cowboys, I believe, sitting around a campfire, and it was on a hillside. They were overlooking a scenic valley and were left with those words as the sun setting. It doesn't get much better than this. I think that's a great slogan for everyone, but I think it's particularly good for married couples. Let me explain. When Mary and I got married, she was my best friend. So I was married to, and I was going to be living with my best friend. So it really doesn't get any better than that. I loved those 2 years before Whitney was born. And everybody, and I mean everybody who was a married couple would say the same things. They would say, enjoy this time together because children will come along and it will change and it will never be the same again. And they were right. It was never the same again. But they were wrong. It did get better. We entered the next phase. First one child, Whitney, and then another child, Lindsay. And even with all the struggles of parenting, we could not imagine life without Whitney and Lindsay. So life did get better. It didn't get any better than that. And then people began to say, well, enjoy them while they're young because they're little now, but when they grow up, it's going to be different. They're going to be different. And they did grow up and things did change. And once again, they were wrong because even with those changes and even with those challenges of parenting, it didn't get any better than that. What lessons did we learn during that phase of our marriage? Well, we learned that one, children should know that no matter how deeply you love them, your top priority is your spouse. If they believe that their relationship with you is the most important relationship in the house and takes top priority, they will behave like this relationship has the top priority in the house. And you're also modeling for them, what you want them to have in their marriage, that they and their spouse have as each other their top priority. We also learned of balance of family and activities. And I think every family wrestles with this. The time spent and the experiences for your children versus the time spent relationally with you. Now, involvement of the experiences for your children is a great thing for them, but it shouldn't come at the expense of a relational time with us. And we struggled with this time. We didn't want to deprive them of their experiences like, sports or music or cheerleading, but we didn't want to deprive them of our time spent with us. Now that we're on this side of the phase, we see that, the parents that typically we look at as being the best parents typically are more, relationally rich and experience poor. They really want the experiences. And we want to be involved in the experiences with them too. But they might not realize it at the time. They really want ourselves more. Lindsay, years ago when we were heading home from a trip and we were just having a talk, and I think she was in college, and she said, and I even wrote it down at the time, she said, Dad, I don't remember all the things that you taught me, but I remember how you made me feel. And Whitney, shortly after she got married, wrote this to me. If you're reading this now, you've already walked me down the aisle to becoming a Hughes. And as we've been dancing and listening to It Won't Be This Way for Long by Darius Rucker, my mind is flooded with memories from my childhood to adulthood and all the incredible memories that have been created along the way. I can still vividly remember chasing you down on a hippity hop as you tried to sneak out of my preschool classroom. I remember you pelting the cousins with balled up socks as we played some of our epic matches of sock wars in the living room. You were always there for us anytime I received an award at school cheered for a game or competition, went off to a homecoming dance, and needed to co-perform at the Fall Follies or the talent show. And lastly, don't control them, but influence them. And we often spend more of our time trying to negatively influence them away from something, when we need to influence them towards something. Influence them toward peers that you really want them to be around. Influence them towards adults that could really make an impact in their life. And really influence them toward God. Their view of God is most influenced by their parents. I want to end with this. About 15 years ago, Mary and I went to an appointment for her. We don't often go together, but I did, and I was sitting out in the waiting room waiting for her, which was a really unusually long period of time. I think about 45 minutes to an hour. And after a while, I became concerned, and finally the nurse came out to me and she said, "Hey, I want you to follow me. I'm going to take you to another waiting area," because she's been sent over to another part of the clinic, which I didn't think was all that unusual, but I was still kind of puzzled. And she led me down the hall, and then she said, "I'll want you to turn into the second waiting room there." And when I turned in, I immediately saw the sign for the second waiting room. It was the oncology unit. And my mind was spinning at that moment as I went in there. And I sat down and waited there for another half an hour. Meanwhile, there were a couple of other men that were sitting in there. And finally, they began to converse with each other. And they both turned to me and they asked, "What kind of cancer does your wife have?" And I was still puzzled, not even knowing why I was there. Finally, I was called into the room. And the doctor did look concerned, but he told me that there were lumps and suspicious lumps, and they would be tested and he would be getting back to us soon. Leaving the clinic that day together and waiting during that period of time as we waited for the results, and then finally hearing the results that were negative, I still began to think life really doesn't get any better than this. Chapter 6, Emotional Word Pictures. All marriages, even those among the fine arts, have to deal with conflict. I mean, no marriage is immune from this. We want to tell you of one effective way to deal with conflict that we were introduced to at a marriage conference years ago. Now, sometimes, conflicts are easily dealt with, but there's other times that the conflict is not resolved and it continues to damage the marriage. And as hard as sometimes you try to explain to a spouse, the reason why you feel the way you do, they may not be able to relate to the words alone. An effective way to reach them is emotional word pictures. Now, it's explained this way. This method uses a story to activate simultaneously the emotions and the intellect of a person. And it uses word pictures because you have to pick something that they're interested in. Otherwise, it's not going to work out. This captures their attention. Then you tap into the emotion. Now, by doing so, it causes the person to experience our words and not just hear them. So they're emotionally engaged in the story. Now, I tried this at Orchard Hills actually years ago. I was teaching the second grade class. And this is one of those second grade class. I think it was filled with nearly all boys. And it was one of those classes that if anyone asked you, which grade are you teaching? And you said the second grade, you would always get a response of, "Oh, are you?" I loved them though. But this particular day it was before Easter, I think the Sunday before. And I was trying so hard to get across to them, the importance of what was about to take place, the event that happened that we were celebrating the next Sunday. And I just knew I wasn't getting through to them. We were having a great time, but they weren't really learning anything. Well, in the middle of the class, the way it's set up, you had the lesson, then you had a break, and you actually had a snack. And there was no rules during the snack. You could talk about anything. And so they're all talking to each other about everything. And one of the boys said to me, he was pretty proud of it. He says, "My mom got a speeding ticket this week." And I said, "Really? What happened?" And he said, "Well, she got pulled over by the policeman, and he came up to the window, and she was really shaking and upset. And then he says, "I'm going to give you a ticket." And I said, "Well, did she speed?" And he said, "I don't really know, but Mom said it really wasn't fair." And I said, "Well, what do you think would happen if the policeman pulled over your mom and he came up to the car and she hadn't been speeding at all, and he said, 'Ma'am, I'm going to give you a speeding ticket.' How do you think that she would feel?" And he got kind of upset, and he said, that would be really unfair. That wouldn't happen." And I said, okay, what would happen if your mom got pulled over by the policeman and he came up to the car and he said, "Ma'am, I'm going to give you a ticket." And then he said, "I want you to get out of the car and I'm going to put handcuffs on you." And he actually began to get kind of upset, and he kind of shouted out, and he says, "They wouldn't do that. I wouldn't let them do that." And he was kind of shouting, and some of the other kids heard him and began to listen to our conversation. And so I said, "Well, what would happen if you pulled him over, if the policeman pulled her over and he came up and he gave her a ticket and he pulled her out of the car and said, 'I'm going to arrest you and I'm going to take you down to the jail and you're going to spend some time in jail.'" Well, by then, a bunch of the boys are listening. And so they're all shouting, "They wouldn't do that. They can't do that. It would never happen. That's not fair." And I said, actually, it did happen. And the whole class was engaged at that point. And they said, "It never happened." And I said, "Yeah, it actually did happen. It happened to Jesus." And there was complete silence in the class. And they were looking at me with these just puzzled looks on their face. And I said, "It really did happen." I mean, think about it. Jesus never did anything wrong. And they arrested him. And then they said things about him that were not true at all. And he was tried. And he was proven guilty, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. And then they beat him. And he had not done nothing to deserve the beating. And then they killed him by nailing him to a cross. And he didn't do anything wrong. And yet he allowed himself to have all that done to them, even though it wasn't fair. And I said, "Do you know why that happened?" And they were yelling out, "It's not fair. That was not fair." And I said, "It wasn't fair. But you know why he did that? He did that because of this incredible love for you." And so I began to wonder if they would ever remember that. I mean, at that point, they were upset. There was a couple of them that were actually crying, and their parents had just come to get them. And so I'm trying to explain to their parents as they're coming out in the hall, and some of them are still angrily shouting about, the fairness of everything that happened. And I'm explaining to the parents, what we've been talking about. And it was a month later. We taught once a month. And so we got together as a class, and I thought they're second graders. They probably won't remember this. And I brought up in the middle of the lesson, I said, "Do you remember a couple months ago when we were talking about the traffic ticket and Jesus?" And they said, "Yeah, he was killed and it wasn't fair." And they were real upset and emotional again. And I thought, it really does work.
Well, here's another example of an emotional word picture that was used in 2 Samuel. King David had sinned by having Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, killed in battle so that he could take Bathsheba as his wife. So the Lord sent Nathan, the prophet, to David with this word picture. Nathan said, "There were 2 men, one rich and one poor. The rich man had a large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had only a little lamb that he had bought and raised. It grew up with him and his children. Scripture says it shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms, like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and the rich man wanted to prepare a feast for this traveler. But the rich man refused to kill one of his own animals for the feast. He took the lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the feast. Well, King David burned with anger and said, "The man who did this deserves to die." Then Nathan said to David, "You are that man.
See, it was an emotional word picture. And it probably reached David in a way that just telling him in words alone would have never tapped into that emotion. Jesus used that in parables. I mean, remember in the story of the prodigal son, how the people heard, the crowd that listened to this story heard that how God felt about people that turned back to him, how emotional he was. And they were able to really connect that in a way. Word pictures lock it into our memory because it activates both sides of the brain. This is such an effective thing to use for your children and also at times to be used with your spouse. Chapter 7, Our Marriage Story. This is the final word. Because each marriage has its own story. And our marriage has benefited most from 4 words. Love is a decision. You know, it's a feeling too, but if it's only a feeling, feelings can be manipulated. If love is a decision, then it's a commitment. And that doesn't change no matter how we feel. And love is not always an easy decision. But if you want that happily married for a lifetime, it is so worth it. Now, there's several stories that I think for you and certainly for us that inspire you during your marriage. But this one inspired me early on in our marriage. In order to tell it, I must have to tell a story before the story. If you've ever been to a traditional worship service, or if you've been to a funeral, you've probably heard this hymn before. Horatio Spafford was a successful lawyer in the 1800s, but he also was a really good businessman. So he had a lot of holdings in Chicago along the river there. He had a big family. He had 4 daughters and he had a son. He lost his son early in life to scarlet fever. And then later, shortly, they actually lost all of their buildings, all of his businesses in the Great Chicago Fire. His family had been invited around that time to go to Europe. Dwight Moody was having an evangelistic campaign, and he wanted them to join him in it. And they were packed to go, but then the fire broke out. So Horatio had to stay behind as his family went over to Europe, and then he was going to catch up as soon as he was able to legally lay claim to his properties as they were going through the court system. His family was traveling in the middle of the Atlantic, and they were struck by another ship, and their ship went down in a surprising 12 minutes. His daughters, all 4 of them, perished, but his wife was found unconscious on a piece of the wreckage and actually rescued by the other boat. When she arrived to Europe, she sent back a telegram which said, "Survived alone, what shall I do?" And it was then that Horatio, as quickly as he could, got passaged on a boat to go and join his wife in Europe. He had told the captain when he was about midway in the Atlantic, he said, "At about the approximate place where my daughter's ship went down, if you could come and get me in my stateroom." And the captain did. And Horatio came up on the deck. He was alone, and he walked to the railing, and he looked at the sea. And that is when he wrote the words to that hymn. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to know, it is well with my soul." Now that's not the story, but that's the story within a story. Horatio wrote the words. He never wrote the music. It was his good friend, Philip Bliss, that wrote the music to those words. 2 months after he had written the music, he was a great songwriter. Philip Bliss and his wife were going up to visit some family in another state. And as they were returning, they had to return early because their train was going to run into a lot of weather. And it did. It ran into some snowstorms and drifts. And the train, on going over a bridge, one of the engines made it to the other side. The other one didn't. It capsized and ran off the rails and into a ravine. And those were wooden boxcars. They broke into flames, and Horatio was thrown from the train, but his wife wasn't. And when he finally found out where she was trapped inside of a mangled car and he tried to get to her, but he couldn't. And witnesses there were able to see that Horatio went to her and he held her hand as both of them actually perished together. The reason why I tell you this, because you might think that this really, and argue that it really wasn't a wise decision, but it was a sacrificial love that he had. And that's what we're called on, to have a sacrificial love. Sacrificing within marriage. Sacrificing is not very popular. Sacrificing is really preferring the other person, giving them the top priority in the relationship. And that's a difficult thing to do. And that is a struggle to do throughout the marriage. But we have both seen that it's the most fulfilling part of our marriage, is that sacrifice. Mary and I don't want just our story to be our story. We want our story to impact our children. We want the story of our marriage to affect our grandchildren. And we're even hoping that our story, our marriage story, will even affect generations to come that we may never meet. Every one of us has a marriage that ripples down through the generations. And what we really want them to see is a marriage. You can look at me like that.
Sorry. Checking notes, because I'm not sure where you're going.
And what we really want them to see is a marriage that is happily married for a lifetime, that is among the fine arts.